Welcome to the 18th year of the Senior Honors Thesis Defenses. Thank you for taking time out of your day to join in this celebration of 9 months of hard work. At this time, I want to acknowledge several individuals and groups that have been unbelievably important to the process. First, the administration and faculty at Pulaski Academy for supporting the thesis project over the past 2 decades. Secondly, I want to thank Ms. Sarah Gorman, who has been responsible for a lot of the promotional work and the technology assistance to make this day possible. And her support has been unbelievable in this past several weeks. And finally, I want to go and to thank the committee members, Ms. Schuster and Ms. Henner, for being part of Chaelie's project. I love, by the way, that opening slide photo. That's a great photo, by the way. So we are on our 4th defense in day 1. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Chaelie to defend her thesis for 15 to 20 minutes. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for coming to watch my thesis defense today. My name is Chaelie, DeJohn, and I will be sharing with you all Intelligence Despite Deception, an analysis of neglect on learning disabilities. In this presentation, I will be focusing on learning disabilities and how these disabilities affect overall performance in the classroom, extracurriculars, and preparation for the future. Additionally, I will be covering biological and environmental impacts, mental health, and the importance of strong communication skills. Journal sources from Learning Disability Quarterly, Annals of Dyslexia, and the Journal of Educational Research provided me not only with background information on learning disabilities, but also an in-depth view of how these disabilities affect someone's everyday life and future in multiple ways. These 2 book sources, Different Learners by Jane M. Healy and The Handbook of Learning Disabilities by H. Lee Swanson, Karen R. Harris, and Steve Graham, broke down complex terms and provided the evidence needed to back up my argument in this project. I got to interview a few high school students who had different types of learning disabilities, which was helpful to get to add in their experiences and struggles of having a learning disability all of their life. I also interviewed a special education teacher, Melanie Henner, and I got to learn about her experiences working with students across the spectrum. What is a learning disability? A learning disability is a condition that makes acquiring knowledge and learning at the same level as the rest of your peers difficult. If a classmate is working at a slower pace and cannot grasp basic skills such as language, reading comprehension, or writing, then they most likely have some type of learning disability. Throughout the 19th century, studying the brain became a popular phenomenon. Neuroscientists became fascinated that the human brain could be various sizes, especially when examining the left and right hemispheres. This was their motivation to figure out if size or any kind of slight change in the brain could cause a drastic change in cognitive abilities. When examining how learning disabilities develop, the area of the brain to look at would be the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe of the brain is the primary area that is involved with fundamental learning abilities such as planning, organization, attention, and impulse control. When a learning disability is developed, the frontal lobe is dysfunctioning in a way that alters cognitive processing. Learning disabilities is a broad spectrum, so a category in that would be spatial disabilities, which are for people who have more trouble with spatial differentiation. And 3 examples with that would be dyslexia, dysgraphia, and visual spatial disorder. Dyslexia is having difficulties with reading, writing, and spelling skills. Some signs and signals would be getting letters mixed up, struggling to spell and comprehend words, and learning at a much slower rate. Dysgraphia is when the brain is unable to form the function to write coherently and understand math and graphing. Signs would be poor handwriting, spacing letters and numbers properly, and struggling to copy information from the board. Visual spatial disorder is having a misunderstanding of measurements in space. Signs would be struggling to copy notes from the board, directions, having trouble spacing numbers and letters, and difficulty localizing objects. Laws such as Section 504, Americans with Disabilities Act, No Child Left Behind, and Individuals with Disabilities Education Act were created to ensure people with all types of disabilities could receive accommodations and to also be able to get a job and education. In other words, these laws are how people with disabilities got rights. In the 1970s, there were 1.75 million children with disabilities who were excluded from schools entirely, and 2.5 million who were in programs that did not meet their needs. Section 504 was created to end discrimination towards disabilities and allowed for students with learning disabilities to be included in schools with children who did not have learning disabilities. ADA connects to Section 504 and was created to make sure it covered anything that 504 failed to mention. The two acts combined were created for inclusion for people with disabilities and later after being modified, the law was expanded for people with ADHD as well. NCLB was created to help students with learning disabilities to become college and work ready. This act provides students with high achieving goal planning that will be met through hard work and the resources provided. IDEA is the act most people with learning disabilities fall under. This act was created to provide children with learning disabilities and to have the opportunity to receive better educational services if needed. For some reason, it's going back. Hold on. Sorry for technical difficulties. There we go. Sorry. The testing process evaluates all aspects of a child's learning capabilities and breaks down any learning difficulties that seem to be present. These tests tend to be very lengthy, taking a course of multiple hours and multiple days, depending on how complex the diagnosis may be. Results usually come about 2 to 3 weeks after the assessment is completed, which will explain what exact learning disability a child may have and what accommodations they need. These tests are created to be very tedious and specific to ensure the most accurate results. The best time to be tested would be around early learning stages such as preschool or kindergarten. During this stage, parents and teachers can use the Wetman Auditory Discrimination Test to track reading and learning patterns to see if their performance rate is significantly lower than their peers. By tracking signals and performing evaluations when the child is younger, this will allow for them to receive accommodations at the early stages of educational development, so by the time they reach high school, they have had years to strengthen reading comprehension and writing skills. Many impacts such as biological and environmental can have an effect not only on the development of learning disabilities, but also on whether or not the child can be evaluated. Genetics have the biggest effect on the traits a child acquires from their parents. With genetics, it's more than just eye and hair color and diseases that can pass down through generations. It's the same for learning disabilities. There's no exact guarantee a child will inherit a learning disability from their parents or if it's in their history of genetics, but the chances are much higher compared to someone who has no genetic history. For gender, boys are more susceptible to having a learning disability than girls because of the way their brain develops from a young age. Women are born with a much larger left hemisphere, which causes them to mature faster. Since males are born with a smaller left hemisphere in the early stages of development, their logical and thinking skills develop slower, so boys are more likely to struggle with language-based learning, and the development of language comprehension could easily be delayed. Having a lower socioeconomic status can put a child at risk for not receiving proper evaluations or the access to receive any type of testing at all. Evaluations can be a costly burden on families, so if the tests are not provided by the school, then the child will most likely never be tested, which sets them up for academic failure. Race typically ties into SES and can determine opportunities and resources. Integration in schools did not occur until the 1950s, so minorities did not have educational opportunities until much later and still do not necessarily have full opportunities now. The dropout rate for minorities is much higher, especially for those who have a learning disability and a lower SES. Evaluations are not required and are not provided by all schools. So if the opportunity to get tested is not easily available, then they will probably never get tested and dropout rates will continue to increase. The quality of mental health determines one's overall being and success. People with learning disabilities are at a higher risk of experiencing symptoms of anxiety, stress, and depression, especially when trying to meet high expectations and have pressure from school, which can cause them to get more overwhelmed and unable to control their emotions. This stress, anxiety, and depression tends to stem from the school environment and the constant fear of failure. Learning how to have a positive mindset and proper coping methods will teach the person to become more relaxed in situations and control their overwhelming emotions. Having a counselor available in schools to help teach them these coping methods is easier, and to have an expert on hand versus having to go to a counselor outside of school. Also, by having teachers pay closer attention to students' mental health, this will help make the student make sure they do not get overwhelmed and feel like they cannot get help in the classroom, especially when they're too embarrassed. If they have a question in front of the whole class, they can ask the teacher privately if the teacher understands. Communication skills begin to develop at a young age and are crucial skills for future success academically and socially. About 75% of people with learning disabilities have poor social skills. Social skills training was designed to help children with learning disabilities work on improving those skills to have academic excellence and a successful social life. Many times, people with learning disabilities tend to miss picking up on specific social cues, so by developing these skills and learning how to communicate with others, the child will become more comfortable around their peers and others and are more likely to participate in the classroom and in activities. Researchers have also noted that students tend to perform better in school when they are doing well socially, because if they are not doing well socially, their mental health tends to be worse, and this can alter their motivation and intensity of emotions. Social emotional learning is an emotional intelligence practice that was created to be implemented into schools to show the importance of social and emotional factors determining success. SEL provides students with a greater chance of success by teaching them how to recognize emotions in self and others, examine strengths and areas that need improvement, and combine social and academic learning to overall strengthen social skills. Schools that do not use SEL tend to have more cases of students with poor mental health and tend to struggle and drop out of school, and these dropout rates are even higher for students with learning disabilities. Inclusion in the classroom is one of the first steps towards preparing children with learning disabilities for the future. Originally, many students with learning disabilities had to learn separately from their peers so they would not get behind, but this ended up being worse for the student and also weakened their social and communication skills with others. Students can keep up with their peers as long as they are given their accommodations and can receive assistance when needed. This is where teachers typically tend to misunderstand that when a student needs accommodations, maybe they need to maybe the teacher needs to go easier on them, or if they're going to be in the same classes with their peers, then they should not be able to receive their accommodations if they want to be at the same pace. But what the student needs is something in between. Teachers focus more on their weaknesses and concerns rather than their capabilities and improvement of skills. It's okay for teachers to be concerned, but not to the extent to where they are not helpful and hold back the student from their full potential. Even though inclusion in schools have improved, does this inclusion end after school? It can, but unintentionally, and here's why. Extracurriculars are how you make close friends, especially when you're younger. Typically, when you're around 4 years old, your parents will put you in some kind of activity outside of school, whether that's like soccer or dance, to not only find a hobby, but to also make friends. And when you're also making friends when you're younger, you typically start having conversation based off of a common hobby or an activity you do together. So if the student is not involved in these extracurriculars, it's going to be more challenging for them to make these conversations and make friends. Extracurriculars overall create social acceptance, help improve social and academic skills, develop relationships, and become connected with the community. There are also many activities that accommodate to people with learning disabilities, and it's also great to use these activities as a stress reliever and to find your passion along with making friends. One of the biggest concerns amongst parents and teachers is whether or not their child is going to be college ready. But what exactly defines college ready? Is it having a high GPA, high test scores, passing all the required courses given over the past 4 years of high school? There's much more than just academics that determines if someone is college ready. Many times, students with learning disabilities are viewed as being dependent on others, but that is not necessarily the case. If the student takes responsibility with their learning disability, then they should have no problem with meeting the college readiness standard. The skills that colleges want students with learning disabilities to have are knowledge of their disability, knowledge of their rights and responsibility, as well as post-secondary school responsibilities regarding accommodations and self-advocacy skills. Students will have an easier transition if they use self-advocacy. Self-advocacy and being aware of what accommodations are available, such as knowing if special education services are offered on campus, will help the student succeed and have a smoother transition. Using self-advocacy will not only help grow the student's social skills, but will also improve their independent living skills and help them towards reaching their future career goals. When students with learning disabilities pick a career path, there is typically a negative stigma. From being 4 years old to being 18 years old, you typically have some dream career, whether that's becoming a doctor, a lawyer, a professional dancer, whatever it is, that when students with learning disabilities have these same dreams, they're looked down upon for not being intelligent enough or not fully capable of reaching these goals. So due to this negative stigma, people with learning disabilities tend to have lower educational and occupational attainment. Many careers require you to have strong communication and social skills. As long as these students are being included in classes with the students without learning disabilities, students with disabilities end up strengthening those skills that will be needed in the future. Lastly, a positive mindset is key. By setting goals and surrounding yourself with others who support and believe in you, people with learning disabilities will be on the right track to success. The main question I got asked throughout my research process with this topic was, are learning disabilities more common now, or is there just an increase of awareness? Learning disabilities are very common, but I would say more people know about it now due to better evaluations, and that's why there seems to be such a big increase in diagnoses. So there are no cures to learning disabilities, but with more awareness of how important it is to work with children with learning disabilities, the student can become stronger. There are many steps parents and teachers can take to become more aware if their child is showing signs of having a learning disabilities. Parents need to start tracking signals and signs of how their child learns at a young age and whether or not they seem to be struggling or not grasping onto material as quickly as their peers. If parents start tracking earlier, then their child can get an evaluation younger rather when they're older and have been struggling in school for years. Even requiring earlier screenings in general would be more beneficial, so less major cases will pop up when the child is much older, like in middle school or high school. Having an early screening will allow for the child to get accommodations and assistance earlier rather than needing it their whole educational career and nothing is being done about it till they're 14. By the time they're 14, it'll be harder to strengthen those reading comprehension and writing skills because the coursework is becoming more difficult. Lastly, one of the biggest things I got from students that I interviewed and read in many journal articles is that teachers are not educated enough on learning disabilities and promoting inclusion and fairness in the classroom. A way to help improve the teacher and student situation at the same time would be to provide more funding for support in the classroom for children with learning disabilities. Teachers could learn from therapies done outside of the classroom by allowing the therapist to come into the classroom with the students so the teachers could be educated on how they can help the student while the student is still receiving the assistance they need. Thank you.
All right.
Yay, Chaelie.
I will start with the first question, and then I'll turn it over to Ms. Schuster and Ms. Henner. How often have you run across misdiagnosis? Is that something that is a major problem? Any of the literature talk about this and how prevalent it is?
A few of the journal articles I read definitely talked about misdiagnosis, but it was more gravitated towards ADHD rather than dyslexia, dysgraphia, and visual spatial disorders. But I would say that maybe there'd be more misunderstandings if the evaluations aren't as specific, then they could have been casted in a bigger category rather than a super specific case of a learning disability.
Have there been cases of backlash against accommodations where school districts that might have financial problems like resent having to pour money into these resources? Has that at all been a problem that you read about at all in the research?
It seems to me the problem from what I read isn't as now isn't as much of a problem as it was back in the day, because I interviewed a mom who has a daughter and a son who has dyslexia, And she said when she was in high school, the teachers would not allow her to have accommodations, even though she had the accommodations and she had the testing done. They just told her she was stupid. It would never be able to be anything because they didn't believe in learning disabilities. But now more people are educated on learning disabilities and how important those accommodations are. So I feel like there's probably still issues today, but it's probably not as big of an issue as it was versus in like the 80s or 90s.
Ms. Schuster?
Hey, Chaelie, sorry about my internet earlier, but as you can see, I'm wearing my seatbelt. I drove to the end of the road to get a good connection. So sorry about that. One of the things as a special educator myself that has always frustrated me is the lack of mental health tied with students with learning disabilities, because things that, and you and I've talked about this, what I have always seen is a lot of stress and pressure and undue anxiety due to not providing accommodations. I'm just curious what you think about the ruler approach that we've implemented this year at Pulaski Academy. I think it's a great thing. I want more students to buy into it, but I wonder what you think as a student, and after researching this topic, what do you think that, or what benefits do you see that program providing for our students that have learning disabilities specifically?
I feel like that program would honestly help students with learning disabilities a lot. I believe teachers would become more educated on how to give the students the accommodations they need, especially knowing from some teachers not understanding why certain students need extra time, even though they have a learning disability. I feel like this program will show like this is why they need it. And so there should be no conflict to where students shouldn't be able to receive any accommodations they need.
I'm also curious, what do you think is the most important thing you've learned through your research? What is something that you just had, it was an aha moment, like, I did not realize that, or oh, I get it. What did you learn from all this?
The biggest thing I would learn, because this topic hits kind of personal to me because I do have a learning disability, is that there's more people who have the same mental health issues as I do and feel the same way of feeling stressed and anxious through the school pressure, but still don't want to be treated any differently than a normal student. It was really amazing to me that there are multiple students, even other ones I interviewed, everyone said the exact same thing, that sometimes teachers go too easy on them or they don't give them their accommodations. And they want their accommodations, but they don't want to be treated as less than their peers. And I feel like that's so important. And that was something great to see throughout my research.
Well, I think you've done a great job. Congratulations.
Thank you, Ms. Schuster.
Welcome.
Ms. Henner?
Sorry,
Chaelie, would you turn off your presentation?
Oh, yes, my bad.
No, that's all right.
Okay, Chaelie, do you feel like public schools or private schools are better equipped to serve students with learning disabilities? And what's one thing that you think they could do to close that gap?
I honestly feel like this could go either way, because in one way, it could be private schools, and that's because of the student to faculty ratio. In private schools, you have less people, so a special education teacher can find more time to spend with those students because they don't have as many. But when you're in public schools, there's the student to faculty ratio is much higher, to where the special education teachers may not have time to meet with every student individually. So to close that gap, what you could do is have multiple special education teachers per grade, so then the numbers would kind of even out more. But also the problem where it could be better at public schools than private schools is because public schools have to ensure that students get their accommodations, while when you're at private school, they can turn down your accommodations. So there's no liability in private schools like there is at public schools. So it can honestly go either way.
I agree. I'm really proud of you, Chaelie.
Thank you.
I'm going to chime in about the something I've done with almost all the topics today. What would you do differently, especially regarding interviews? I know we had some ambitious ideas about how many to conduct and such. If it was August 15th again and we were redesigning this project, What would you do differently regarding interviews?
Honestly, I wish I could have gone to the IRB, which is the internal review board, to get approval for human subject research. So I could have interviewed public school students with a broader, diverse background, because more of the students I interviewed were either private school or homeschooled. So it would have been so much better if I could have just gone out and gotten more interviews. But because of, I can't think of the word, because of like consent and everything and trying to keep information private, I can't just go out on my own and ask people if they have a learning disability, or ask like Miss Henner or Miss Schuster for people who have learning disabilities. Confidentiality, that's the word.
Questions from this distinguished audience here, and it is distinguished.
I have a few. So you mentioned early on, you know, the I don't think you actually mentioned numbers, but that males are diagnosed more than females, and you mentioned the correlation in the size of their brains and the left hemisphere. I used to work with neurodiverse students, and at that time, it was almost three out of 4 students would be male in the classrooms there, and I didn't know if you came across any, you know, and why that is a huge gap between male and female, and of course maybe at younger in the younger stages of life, the brain size might be different, but how does that brain size then correlate as you get older? Did you come across anything that speaks to that?
I do remember a little bit in the beginning of my research process reading about this. It was around still 3 out of 4 were males. And as the male gets older, the brain, like both the hemispheres of the brain start to come to the same size. But I think the left one is still smaller, and that the females still just have the larger left hemisphere, if I'm remembering correctly. But as the male ages and becomes more mature, I believe that language comprehension becomes much easier unless they have other either biological or environmental impacts at a young age, then it can cause them to develop at a slower rate.
Awesome, thank you. I'll let someone else have a turn, and then I can come back if.
Hey, Chaelie, I'll do one. So not necessarily about the librarian, but for teachers that aren't maybe the Miss Schuster and the Miss Henner, so maybe we don't know everyone's personal issues, but just like if I have a kid who's struggling to find a book to read, I just say, what are you interested in? And so I do it from the literary point of view. What do you think teachers in the whole realm of school could do to help these kids that maybe need more than just the Miss Shu and the Miss Henner? We can't all be Miss Shus and Miss Henner. We're doing our best, but what's something that other teachers can do?
That's a really good question. I would say maybe something that teachers could do is maybe do some research on their own, as well as maybe, especially in your case, with finding a book that's perfect for a child to read, maybe even having reading tests to see where their reading level is at. So to make sure they don't read something that's way above or way under their reading capabilities. And so then you can start at what they test as and then work their way up to improve their reading comprehension skills. So they're not overwhelmed, but you're also not giving them something that's too easy at the same time, if that makes sense.
It does. And I mean, I talk to the literature teachers and kids who don't always read best. So we don't do like reading tests at middle school, like they do AR tests in lower school. But I don't know, I can tell who doesn't like to read when they say I don't like to read, but we try. So I typically find a topic they're interested in. But I don't know, we try that. But I talk to those teachers, but is there anything just, is it just listening? Is it just knowing where they might need extra help, or providing a room in X period or after school where they could just kind of relax and hang out. And maybe if homework takes extra time, they have a safe spot to do the extra homework.
Yes, I think that would be a great idea for them to have that extra time and that extra space to be able to catch up on work or get help with reading and anything they need, especially if they don't want to do it in front of their classmates and they know they can come to a safe space to get that help, especially when teachers like Ms. Schuster and Ms. Henner aren't available, to know that they can come to other teachers who understand and know how to help. That makes sense.
Harper.
Hey, Chaelie. So I was talking with you about this, I think, first semester, and you were talking about how some of your sources, they kept talking about ASD, which is my thesis topic. And I was wondering what you thought we needed to do to really allocate sources to a lot more disabilities and offer more specialized supports. Like, is that just education? Is that another battle that we need to be fighting? What do we need to do there?
Ooh, I completely forgot about that. I remember us talking about that first semester, how I kept coming across sources that would talk about your topic as well. And I was so confused because I didn't realize how closely they tied together, which is funny because when I look at the two, I think they're so different, but a lot of times disabilities can be crumbled all together. And I think it's important with trying to find more modern research now that it's kept separate, and whether that's from needing more people to advocate for that, because treatments are different, accommodations are different for each student whose disability is different, and that's not realized as much now or in a lot of research that I came across. So what was the other half of your question? I'm so sorry.
You answered it. It was just like, what do we need to do to recognize that? So get the word out, talk to people about different.
Hey, Harper, I want to pipe in here and just tell y'all what you're doing now is researching, and you're bringing this idea of students being capable of achieving more to light. And the more you do that, the better off things become for everybody. And it's something I've battled for 25 years in education, is telling people, hey, these are bright kids. These kids can do this. These kids can achieve. And there's nothing that gets me more excited when somebody young and new comes along with fresh ideas and things we can do. You know, there's no perfect fit for any child with a learning disability because, like you said, there's so much comorbidity within that things cross over. And so what y'all are doing is bringing light to this. And I think y'all have just done a fantastic job. So keep pushing through. That's what I can tell y'all.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So a lot of people that I know that have learning disabilities, they don't just have one, they might have two or even three. So how did you come across anything in your research about dealing with more than one learning disability? Like, what does that look like in the classroom, or what should it look like in the classroom?
Almost every student I got to interview had multiple disabilities, and also they were tested very young, typically around like 5, 6, or 7 out of the people I interviewed. And I think over time evaluations have gotten more specific, so that may not pop up as much, but I feel like having more than one learning disability could add on more to the challenge. And usually they'll have more extended accommodations when that occurs, so they can make sure they have all the resources they need to still produce work at the same level as their peers. Any other questions?
Caroline, did Caroline have a question? Caroline Perry? Oh. Okay, sorry. I thought I saw your hand up.
I think what was just brought up is a really important thing to talk about, and that and I know that there's conflicting feelings on what we label this as, and so of course we are identifying these as disabilities, but I think it's becoming more popular to call it just what it is that we are all just such different learners, and so we're just neurodiverse. And without going too far into autism, because I'll leave that for Harper's presentation, which gets me all really excited. But in almost every case of autism, there's a secondary diagnosis. And I think that I'm an adult with ADHD, and it was a real struggle. I went to Pulaski Academy, and it was hard. And so I think that, you know, we are learning more about it, but I think it's really come to this, the conclusion is that we are all just so different, and that, you know, if teachers are provided with the resources, I think I think what Ms. Schuster was saying about our emotional intelligence training this year, I think it's going to be a really important thing for all of us to be more familiar with and be more in touch with, because we all need to just be more understanding of each other, because we are just so diverse. Neurodiversity is, I think, a strength. I've had the pleasure of working with several high school students who are Ms. Henner's students, and you know, being the art teacher, I get to be a little bit more fun and you know, come at problem solving a little differently than some other disciplines get to. And I think that, you know, if we can band together and bring more awareness and make it more normalized, I think these conversations are really important.
Right. Thank you.
You did a great job.
Thank you so much.
All right, great job. Thank you so much, guys. Let's give a round of applause here. I don't know if we could top day one. Harper, you're going to have day two has their work cut out for them. So that was pretty awesome. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and hope to see everyone over the next 4 days. Great start to Thesis Defense 2020. Thanks so much again.
Good job, Chaelie.
Great job, Chaelie.